This is a video lesson on Boxplots and measures of variability. Your job is going to be to watch this video posted to Google Classroom and follow along and complete the worksheet. Let's look at some definitions. We've already talked about range. Range is calculated by taking the maximum minus the minimum. And range describes how spread out the data is. So when I say how spread out the data is, I mean, what's the maximum? What's the minimum? How much of the data is concentrated at each end? And that's really what we're going to show with the box and whisker plot, or the box plot. The interquartile range describes how spread out some of the data is, and specifically the middle of the data. To calculate the interquartile range, we're going to take the third quartile minus the first quartile, and we'll talk about what those are in just a moment. The last thing we're going to talk about today is a box plot, or it's sometimes called a box and whisker plot. That's going to be a visual depiction of how spread out the data is. A box plot is convenient because it splits the data into 4 groups. It splits it into quarters or quartiles. So we can see how much of the data is at the maximum end of our range and how much of it is at the minimum end. Take a moment right now to pause the video if you need time to copy down these definitions. Let's take a look together at example 1. Mrs. Nichols recently gave a test that was scored out of 50 points. The scores for period 5 are listed below. List the measures of variability and create a box plot to represent the data. So when I say measures of variability, I mean these measures that are listed here: minimum, quartile 1, medium, quartile 3, and maximum. You see that the data is already arranged in order from least to greatest for us here. It goes from 34 to 50. So let's take a look at our different measures of variability. Our minimum, that's our lowest data point, which in this case is 34. The next thing that we can figure out is our maximum. That's our highest data point, which is 50. So we know all our data points live between 34 and 50. Next thing I need to do is figure out the median. So to figure out the median, I need to kind of cancel out my points at either end of the spectrum. So I'll start on the outsides and mark each one until I get to the point in the middle, which in this case happens to be 45. So that tells me that my median is 45. Now that I know that the median is 45, I need to just calculate what the first and third quartiles are. So the first quartile is the median of the smaller half of the data, and the third quartile is the median of the larger half of the data. So when I say the smaller half of the data, I mean I'm literally going to chop my data in half. I know that 45 is the middle of my data if I arrange it from least to greatest. So quartile 1, that's going to be the median of the data below and including 45. So I'll follow that same strategy to calculate the first quartile. Again, the first quartile is the median of the lower half of the data. So I'm canceling out the extremes. So 34 and 45 cancel out, 39 and 44, etc. And what's left in the middle are 2 41s. Since they're the same number, I can just write 41 as my first quartile. The only number I still need to calculate is my third quartile. So that's going to be the median of the upper half of my data. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm chopping my data in half at 45 at the middle of that data set, and I'm pairing off values at each extreme to find the value or values in the middle. So in this case, 47 and 49 are in the middle. I know that 48 is right between them, which means that 48 must be my third quartile. If it wasn't so easy to figure that out, right, because 48 is obviously right between 47 and 49, I could add them up and divide by 2, and that would always tell me whatever number's right in the middle of them. So all of these points, they divide my data into quarters. So my minimum, my smallest number, that's like my 0th quarter. And then my quartile 1, that's my first quarter. My median is like my second quarter because it's halfway through, which is 2 quarters. My third quartile, that's 3/4 of the way through. And my maximum, that's 4/4 of the way through. So I'm going to display this data using a box plot. And the catch with the box plot is that it splits up the data so that I'm looking at 1/4 of the data at a time. So if I look at any single chunk of my box plot, it represents 1/4 of my data. Now, it's always good to include a scale. So I'm going to include a scale that goes from my minimum to my maximum. Right now, I'm too lazy to write every number out, so I'm going to go by 5s. So even though it starts at 34, I'm going to start my labeling at 35, and I'll make sure to put the point for 34 a little to the left of that first label. So I've got 35, 40, 45, and 50, and now I need to label my different parts. My maximum and my minimum, they'll both get labeled with a dot. So I'm putting a dot right now at about 34, and I need to estimate because I only put multiples of 5 along my scale. My first quartile at 41, I'll put a vertical line segment. And the same thing goes for my median and my third quartile. I'll find 45 and then 48 and put vertical line segments there to represent where those data points fall. And then my maximum, like I said before, gets a dot. So now I've got my 5 points marked, and this is why it's called a box plot. I'm going to take the center of my data and kind of make it into a box. It's a rectangle. And it used to be called the box and whisker plot, even though now we mostly call it a box plot. Those whiskers are going to get added on, so you can kind of see where that name came from. And each section of this box plot represents 1/4 of my data. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a bit. Your job right now is to work on example 2. You've seen how to complete example 1. Try example 2 on your own. And then when you're done, watch the video again so that you can see how to calculate or come up with the points for the box plot. Your first step for example 2 should be to put the data in order from least to greatest because the data is not currently in that order. All right. Example 2 says that period 8 took the same test as period 5, and their scores are listed below. So I've got mine in order from least to greatest already. If you need to copy that down, pause the video right now and copy that down. We're going to follow the same exact steps that we did for the first one. We'll start by finding our minimum, which this time is 17, and our maximum, which once again is 50. The next step would be to find the median. So we need to find the data point that's exactly halfway through my data. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm pairing off the minimum and maximum until I have a smaller and smaller data set such that I have either 1 or 2 points in the middle. So this time I had an even number of data points. So my median is between 43 and 48 because I can't have both as my median. So I'm going to take the average of 43 and 48, or the number that's halfway in between them, which is 45.5. So I can do that by adding them together and dividing by 2, or I can just count 43 plus 1 would be 44, 48 minus 1 would be 47, etc. And I could just find the midway point. That's what the median is, the midway point. Now I need to find the first and third quartiles. So I'll split my data in half. And there's no middle this time, so I'm not sharing a point. I just take the lower half of the data up through 43. And I'm going to mark the extremes off until I have 1 or 2 points in the middle. So 22 and 42 pair off, and I'm left with 34 in the middle. So that's my first quartile. In my third quartile, I'm going to do the same procedure, but I'm looking at the upper half of the data from 48 to 50. So I'm pairing off my extremes until I end up with 1 point in the middle, which in this case is 49. So I need my scale to be, or need my range to be a lot larger than in example 1 because my minimum is 17 instead of 34. So I'm going to start counting down at 15 and go up by 5s. Now, if I had thought ahead a little bit, I would have scooted my first example over to the right so that my scales lined up. But it's okay if you didn't do that. Obviously, I didn't do that on my paper either. So I'm going by 5s once again, starting with 15 until I get to 50. And then I'll mark my points. My minimum and maximum get marked with dots. So I'll estimate where 17 and 50 are according to my number line. And then the remaining points, my quartiles and my median, get line segments. So quartile 1 is at 34, my median is 45.5, and my quartile 3 is 49. So there's my box. It goes from 34 to 49, and my whiskers come off the end. Congratulations, you've drawn your first 2 box plots. Now let's talk about what they mean. Take a look at your bottom box plot. Every quarter of your data is broken up by either using a line segment or a rectangle. So what that means is that 1/4 of your data goes from 17 to 34, and 1/4 of your data goes from 49 to 50. So in terms of what our data means, that means in this situation, for example, in period 5, half of the class, 2/4, scored between 45 and 50. And a similar thing is true for 8th period. Half of the class scored between 45.5 and 50. So those medians are really close, meaning that half the students scored fairly well, 45 or 45.5 through 50. If I look at period 5's data, if you look at the pink highlights, what that shows is that 100% of the students scored between 34 and 50. But if you look at the first quartile for period 8, that tells me that 25% of my students in period 8 scored 34 or below. So what that tells me is that even though their medians were really similar, period 8 did worse than period 5 because 1/4 of the students essentially failed the test, whereas in period 5, all of the students got that score as their minimum. So if you take a look, that's the answer to the top question on the back of your page. So if you're not sure what I said, rewind the video a little bit and watch that again so you can write at least 1 sentence for an answer to that question. And then try example 3 on your own. There's no video answer key for example 3. So try your best on it and ask me if you have any questions, and I'm happy to answer your questions for you. Good luck.